I found a way to stop time, but I wasn't alone. I found the watch because the roof was leaking. A brown circle spread over the attic ceiling after a week of rain. So I went up with a bucket and a towel. The hatch stuck half open. Hot air with insulation and old wood pushing down on me. Everything up there smelled like cardboard and mothballs. I crouched beside a stack of magazines and a crate of tangled Christmas lights, nudged aside a warped photo album, and uncovered a small wooden box I didn't recognize. It was plain, no carving, no lock, just a lid that slid under my thumb. Inside lay a silver pocket watch on a thin black chain. The glass face smudged, the case scuffed on the edges like it had lived in someone's pocket for years. My grandfather's things took up most of the attic. This felt like one of his. He'd been the kind of man who kept screws sorted by size and saved string because you never know. I pressed the tiny latch. The cover sprang open on a tired hinge. The hands ticked along like any other watch. Second hand crisp. Minute hand steady. When I tilted the lid to catch the light from the small attic window, faint letters gleamed on the inside. Time always collects its debts. I smiled at the drama of it. Imagined my grandfather choosing the inscription and shaking his head at how sentimental he was being, then turning to the practical business of oiling the hinge. I almost closed the lid, but the little crown at the top knurled, cool under my thumbnail, asked to be wound. The way a door asks to be tried. I wound it 2 turns. It ticked on. I pulled the crown out with a soft click. The house went silent. Completely silent. The rain on the roof stopped in the middle of a drop. The creak of the rafters paused mid-groan. Dust hung in the air like snow photographed with a flash. My body took a breath and forgot how to finish it. I slid to the window and pressed my forehead to the hot glass. The street below held its breath with me. A car sat mid-turn at the stop sign, driver's mouth open around a syllable. The neighbor's dog hovered 4 inches off the lawn, front paws curled, ears frozen in a wind that no longer moved. A curtain in the house across the street bowed outward and stayed there, as if the day had hardened around it. I pushed the crown back in. Sound returned in a rush. The last raindrop slapped the roof. The car completed its turn. The dog landed, and the curtain fell. My knees unlocked. I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the feeling had nowhere else to go. I told myself I had imagined it, that the attic heat had baked my head. Then I pulled the crown again. The tick stopped, and the world held. I stood alone in a painting that only I could walk through. On the first day, I did exactly that. Walked down the stairs, through the kitchen with the calendar still stuck on last month, past the damp towel thrown over a chair, out the front door I forgot to close. The smell outside sharpened. The rain had rinsed the city, and all the usual noise was missing. So every other sense stepped forward. I crossed the street without checking, because the bus that would have flattened me sat halfway through the crosswalk like a toy. The driver's coffee hovered under his lip. A girl with a red umbrella leaned at an angle that would have kept her standing if the world still had the wind to push against her. My phone showed the time, but the minutes didn't change there either. A minute stretched long and elastic when fear finally caught up. I hurried home and pushed down the crown. Noise rushed back. Somewhere down the block, a siren woke. I set the watch on the kitchen table and sat with both hands flat beside it. Palms damp with sweat. Eyes on the tiny hands ticking again like they were innocent. I should have put it back in the box and shoved the box under a heavy stack of books. But I didn't. I took the watch with me the next day, like a secret. The first experiments were small. In the grocery store, I pulled the crown beside the cereal aisle. A boy with a cart full of snacks floated mid-step on one foot, mouth open around a laugh that I couldn't hear. But it had shape. I stepped around him and set the cookies back on the shelves from where he'd knocked them. In the produce section, a mist nozzle had burst 2 droplets from its head before the timer cut, and they hung there. Perfect beads caught between water and air. I stuck a finger into one. It clung and didn't break. When I pushed the crown, it slid down my knuckle and fell into the lettuce, late by the length of my astonishment. At a cafe, I sat by the window and watched people move on fast forward after I let time go again, as if the world were correcting from the pause, catching up. I tried it there too. Pulled the crown, stood, walked around the counter. The barista's hand hovered over the steam wand. The milk swirled in a white curve and stayed. I put a tip in the jar, a quiet superstition, then stepped back to my chair and resumed the day. The barista flinched like a hiccup and spilled a little. She looked around, confused. The jar had more money in it. She smiled at no one and kept working. I felt foolish for how pleased I was with myself. I told myself I wouldn't take anything, that I wouldn't pry. I wouldn't use the watch to do anything I wouldn't do if time kept moving. That held for about 4 days. On the 5th day, on a bus, a man's wallet slipped from his pocket in slow motion while he reached for the cord to signal a stop. I pulled the crown and caught the wallet 3 inches above the ground. It was heavy with receipts and a family photo and a few bills. He didn't know. When I pushed the crown, he tugged the cord and stepped down into a street he didn't know had paused for him. I got off 2 stops early to walk. That walk taught me much of a city in rhythm. The changing lights, the cadence of heels on concrete, dogtails clinking, crosswalk countdowns that bully you into walking the last 3 steps. When I stopped time, I could stand on the yellow line and look both ways and see the entire tide held at the shore. I stepped closer to faces that I'd never even dared. An old man mid-sneeze, a kid mid-eye roll, a woman mid-prayer with her thumb smoothing the same corner of a photograph over and over. The motion paused so the paper lay flat under a nail that had been painted neatly months ago and grown out. I didn't touch. Looking already felt like trespassing. The first hint came in the park a few evenings later. I'd stopped time to watch a frisbee hover between throw and catch. A dog's mouth open like a crescent, teeth a white arc held just shy of joy. On the other side of the path, beneath an oak, something stood in the shade where the sun couldn't decide if it should bother. Tall, narrow, a shape that didn't collect light the way the rest of the world did. I took 3 steps toward it. The outline didn't sharpen. It was as if focus refused to settle there. I pushed the crown without thinking. Everything rushed back to normal, and beneath the tree, nothing but a shadow. I told myself it had always been a shadow and went home a different way. That night, I set the watch on the dresser and lay in bed, watching the ceiling fan turn. I wasn't tired. My mind kept replaying the park, the held breath of things, the not quite there under the oak. I got up, took the watch back to bed, and put it under my pillow like a child hoarding treasure or a bad dream. Sometime after midnight, the idea arrived that I should try the house in the dark. I stood in the hallway in bare feet, the watch in my hand, the paint cool against my shoulder. I pulled the crown. The hum of the refrigerator cut. The streetlight outside my window stopped flickering and simply glowed. My own breath sounded too loud. I tiptoed into the living room because moving softly felt polite. The curtains held halfway open, fabric adrift and unmoving, a sail waiting for wind that wouldn't return until I said so. In the black glass of the television, the room reflected back at me. Couch, lamp, myself. In between the couch and the lamp, a portion of the reflection that wasn't any of those things. A darker dark. A cutout. When I turned around, the room contained only exactly what it should. When I looked back, the reflection had corrected itself. I pushed the crown and the refrigerator's motor kicked in with a relieved sigh. I went back to bed, watch on the nightstand, and slept lightly. The way you do when your door is cracked and you're waiting for a sound. Days fell into a pattern. Morning without the watch. Afternoon experiments, small enough to feel harmless. Switch 2 flyers on a bulletin board. Leave a flower from the median on a stranger's stoop. Stand in the middle of a crosswalk and look up at the sky that wasn't going anywhere. Evening guilt that felt more like excitement, with its tie loosened. Each time I told myself this was it, the last test, the final pull. Each time my thumb found the crown without asking me. Sometimes when I resumed the day, someone nearby would shiver as if a draft had brushed their neck. A man at the corner would pat his jacket suddenly, like checking for a wallet he hadn't lost. Once, a little girl turned her head sharply and looked straight through me, face puzzled, as if she'd heard a name. I stood perfectly still until she looked away. A week after the park, I stopped time at my front door to catch the mail carrier mid-reach. He was halfway through the motion of dropping envelopes in the slot, and I wanted to know if I could take them and tuck them under the rug so they wouldn't scatter on the floor. The watch ticked against my palm, and then it didn't. I bent to collect the mail. When I straightened, someone stood at the foot of my stairs on the landing below. Well, it wasn't someone, or at least I didn't believe it was. Something shaped like the idea of a person, occupying space the way a memory occupies a room. Present enough to push the air, wrong enough for my body to physically recoil. It didn't have a face to meet. It didn't move. I stared until my eyes hurt. I pushed the crown and nearly fell down the last 2 steps. The mail clattered around my ankles. From the sidewalk, the carrier called, You okay up there?" I yelled back that I was fine, voice a little too bright, and gathered envelopes with fingers that didn't really even feel like mine anymore. That night, I put the watch back in its box and slid the box into the back of a drawer. I told myself I could forget the watch. I told myself it would stay where I left it. In the morning, it lay on the dresser with the lid open, hands ticking, face catching a stripe of sunlight through the blinds as if it had slept where it wanted to. I held very still and listened. I reached out, closed the lid, and the hinge made a small sound, like a throat clearing before a story begins. I used to tell myself I was careful, that I had rules, that the watch was a tool and not a trap. I stopped believing all of that the day I stole my first $100 bill. It started small. I convinced myself it wasn't really stealing. A register left open at a corner store, a handful of bills while the clerk stood mid-motion, blinking, frozen in time. I put 2 singles back as if that would make it fair. I walked out with $50 and a stomach full of electricity. I expected guilt. It didn't come, so I did it again. Within a week, the rules I made for myself, don't take too much, don't hurt anyone, don't get caught, felt meaningless. I wasn't thinking about fairness anymore. I was thinking about how far I could push the line without falling over it. I hit ATMs first. Easy. No alarms when nothing moves. I walked into a mall before opening, past a security guard locked mid-step, and stuffed a backpack with cash and electronics until it was almost too heavy to carry. I walked into luxury boutiques I'd only seen from outside, past mannequins frozen mid-undress and stylists paused in the middle of steam-pressing expensive coats. Rings slid off velvet displays into my pocket, watches into the other. I started wearing designer jackets like I'd always owned them. My landlord called to me to say that my balance had cleared and my jaw ached from holding back a laugh. I was invisible. Or maybe I was just stupid. The first time I used a watch on someone intentionally, I told myself it was curiosity. It was a quiet afternoon and I froze time outside a cafe just to breathe, to feel the stillness stretch. There was a girl sitting inside by the window, scrolling through her phone. I stood on the other side of the glass, watching her expression shift, trying to guess what she was reading, who she had texted. That didn't feel like enough. I went inside, walked past tables and chairs, caught in mid-conversation, past a waiter balancing a tray of coffee cups that would crash to the floor the moment I let the world breathe again. I stopped right next to her. I looked over her shoulder, at the messages frozen on her phone, at the private piece of her life paused under my fingertips. I told myself I didn't touch anything. I told myself looking wasn't the same as crossing the line. I didn't like the way the lie tasted, but I swallowed it anyway. I don't remember when I stopped just looking. I started walking into places I had no right to be. Hotel rooms, locker rooms, women's bathrooms. I told myself it was harmless because no one ever knew, because they never even moved. But even in frozen time, there was something wrong about being there. The longer I used to watch, the easier it became to ignore the voice in my head whispering to stop. The watch ticked louder when I wasn't using it now, like it was breathing in my pocket. That's when the shadow stopped waiting. I'd seen it before, far off under the oak tree, at the end of the street, always distant enough to pretend it wasn't real. But one night, after I'd pulled the crown in a bank lobby, it wasn't far anymore. It was standing in the middle of the marble floor, 20 feet from me, a shape darker than its surroundings, featureless and wrong. Its presence was so heavy that for the first time I hesitated before moving. I put the money back in the drawer. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my ears, and shoved the crown in. Time roared like water breaking a dam. The guard by the door sneezed into his elbow. I left without a word. I tried to stop. Really, I did. I put the watch in a drawer, stuffed it under old tax forms, and promised myself a week without touching it. 2 nights later, I woke up with it in my hand. I didn't remember taking it out. I didn't remember winding it. And the lid was already open. The next time I stopped time, the shadow was closer. It stood at the end of my street while the world hung breathless around it. Not moving, not blinking. Facing me. Always facing me. I ran back inside, slammed the door, pulled the curtains shut. When I pushed the crown back in, sound returned. The cars, the wind, the hum of the fridge, but none of it felt the same anymore. It was like the shadow had followed me into the noise. I stopped using the watch completely after that. At least I tried. But the craving built until it hurt, until my thumb itched for the crown without permission. And when I finally gave in one last time, I found out the truth. It didn't wait anymore. When I froze time, it moved towards me. I thought I'd stopped. I told myself I'd thrown the watch in a drawer, buried it under old papers, hidden it where I couldn't even reach it. But even when I didn't touch it, I could feel it. My hand would drift to the drawer in the dark, like it had muscle memory I hadn't given it. My thumb itched for it. My chest ached for the quiet. It didn't take too long to give in. The shadow was waiting for me. The moment time froze, it was there, closer than it had ever been. No longer distant, no longer a vague silhouette at the far end of the street. This time it was standing halfway down the hall in my apartment, a shape darker than the dark around it, sharp edges where shadows shouldn't have edges. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The second hand on the watch was locked, the world suspended, but I had the unbearable certainty that if I so much as blinked, it would close the distance. I shoved the crown in, and the time crashed in like a wave hitting shore. The hallway was empty. I couldn't stop shaking. I started testing it after that, in smaller doses, like checking if the danger was real or if I was spiraling. Sometimes the shadow didn't appear at all. Sometimes it was at the end of my street again, a comfortable, survivable distance away. But every third or fourth time it was closer, always closer. It didn't follow the rules. Nothing else moved when time stopped. Birds hung in the air, curtains stayed mid-sway, but the shadow moved between pauses. 3 nights later, I woke up to silence. Not the usual kind. The kind where you know something is wrong. The refrigerator hum was gone. The street light outside no longer buzzed. I sat up disoriented, and the watch lay open on my nightstand. Crown already pulled out. I hadn't touched it. The world was frozen without me. I turned my head toward the doorway. It was standing in the hall. I forced myself out of bed, every step slow. The floorboards loud under my bare feet, despite the silence of stopped time. I gripped the watch so hard my knuckles whitened, wanting to shove the crown in, but something in me needed to know if it would move. One step into the hall, another, Its shape didn't change, but the weight of its presence made my lungs strain for air. No face, no features, just a wrongness carved into the air. I blinked, and it got closer. I shoved the crown back in, and time roared alive. My bedroom door slammed shut behind me as though the air itself had shifted. The next morning, I left the watch on the counter and locked the door behind me. I drove 30 miles without a destination and parked in an empty lot beside a gas station. I sat in the car and told myself I'd never touch it again. But when I looked down, it was in my lap. I didn't remember bringing it. That night I stopped time again, not because I wanted to, but because I just couldn't stop myself. The quiet was addictive, pulling at me like a tide I didn't want to resist. The shadow wasn't in the hall this time. I had driven back. If I was going to face this, I was going to face this in my own house. But it was right behind the couch. I stood frozen while the frozen world stretched around me, my heart pounding hard enough to make me dizzy. Then for the first time since I'd found the watch, it moved. It physically moved. I saw it moved, not between my pauses or a blink. Just one step. No sound. I slammed the crown back in, so hard it bent slightly under my thumb. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't following me when I used the watch. It was waiting for me to use it. And it was winning. I stopped fighting the watch. I couldn't. It was always there, always closer. I started sleeping with the lights on, but the brightness didn't help. It only made the shadows sharper. The last night began like all the others, restless and exhausted, afraid to close my eyes. I left the watch on the dresser, lid shut, as always, crown pressed tight. I lay back in bed and stared at the ceiling until my vision blurred. Somewhere between one blink and the next, the room went silent. Much too silent. I turned my head slowly, and the watch lay open on the nightstand, the crown pulled out yet again. And yet again I hadn't touched it. Time was frozen again, repeating like a loop. I sat up, my chest tightening, and I scanned the room. The curtains hung stiff in the air. The digital clock on the wall showed the same second it had shown 10 minutes ago. And at the foot of my bed, it waited. I tried shoving the crown back in, but my fingers slid over the metal uselessly. It wouldn't budge. My chest rose and fell too loud in the vacuum of a silent world. The shadow tilted slightly, like it had been studying me, and finally made a decision. It stepped forward. For the first time, I saw it move. Without the safety of the pause, it glided more than walked, edges blurring faintly as if the world refused to define it. My legs wouldn't obey me. I stumbled off the bed, knocking over the lamp, but it made no sound hitting the floor. Everything stayed perfectly, horribly still. I ran through the hallway, across the living room, into the kitchen, shoving chairs and pulling drawers as if barricades meant anything when time itself didn't move. But every corner I turned, every doorway I passed, the shadow stood closer. I tried yanking the front door open, but it wouldn't budge. The lock caught in mid-motion, frozen, just like everything else. And then I felt it. The air behind me shifted. I turned, and it was inches away. I swung at it, an instinct, stupid and useless. My hand passed through like nothing. But the nothing felt heavy, cold in a way that burned. And then it touched me. Everything changed. The weight of the world vanished, but my awareness stayed sharp, cruelly sharp. My arms refused to move, locked mid-swing, my body a statue carved in the wrong pose. I couldn't breathe, not because I was suffocating, but because breath no longer existed. The second hand on the watch hung motionless. I realized, too late, what had happened. I wasn't outside of time anymore. I was trapped inside it. The shadow stepped back, the first and last motion I saw, and dissolved into the stillness around me like it had never been there at all. I don't know how long I've been here. Could be years. Could be centuries. The watch still sits on the floor where it fell, crown out, lid open, frozen in the same unending second. The sunlight streaming through the blinds hasn't shifted a millimeter. The dust in the air hasn't landed. The world hasn't moved, but I'm still awake. I think I understand now. Time always collects its debts. And I was very, very due.